I am really very honored to be with Jennifer and Shannon and the amazing work that they do. And I wanted to dive right in and start with Jennifer and ask, can you tell us what inspired you to write what feels like a prophetic novel?
It's so funny, Jamia. Writing a novel takes such a long time that if you ever happen to write anything remotely timely, it's a sheer accident. There's no way you could possibly plan that. I started writing this book in, I guess it was 2016, when we were at a very different place in terms of um, abortion rights. And it did not occur to me then that we would be at the juncture we are now. Um, at that time, I had been volunteering at a clinic, a reproductive that did reproductive medicine and also kind of general gynecology for women, contraception, and also performed abortions. I volunteered there because I believed in the work they did. I never thought I would write about it. But that experience was so transformative to me that inevitably that's what happened. Um, so I can even remember the exact moment when I knew that I was going to have to write this story. I was working on a hotline at this clinic. So I was answering calls from women all over the country. There were calls about contraception, about, health questions, and a lot of calls from women who wanted to schedule abortions. Women who wanted to schedule one had to first talk to one of the volunteers like me, and we would essentially talk her through the procedure, answer any questions she might have. A lot of the women who called were, very matter of fact. Seemed very at peace with their decisions, and they just wanted to get an appointment and, have the procedure and get on with their lives. But occasionally, women would talk about their reasons for wanting to terminate. And there was, of course, a very broad range of reasons. But one caller told me that if her ex found out she was pregnant, he would come to her house and shoot her kids. So when you think about the reasons why a person might terminate a pregnancy, you could never in your wildest dreams come up with some of the reasons that women actually have. And it was a very humbling moment to me. It made me think about the arrogance of second guessing anybody's decision to have an abortion. Nobody outside that person's life could possibly know the complex web of circumstances that go into the decision. And that was the moment when I knew I was going to have to write about it. It was not a welcome discovery in a way, because it's a hard subject. There's probably no more polarizing subject in American life. And I'd come, from a background, and Jimmy and I have shared this. I come from a kind of a religious background where everybody I knew was opposed to abortion. I'd gone to 12 years of Catholic school. I had been told abortion was wrong before I even understood how you got pregnant. So that's where I started out, and eventually, became strongly pro-choice, but never so strongly as after I answered that phone call on the hotline. So that was really the spark that led to the writing of Mercy Street. The story centers on a character who's a counselor at a clinic like the one where I worked. She oversees the hotline, oversees volunteers like I was, and she also counsels some patients in person. The novel opens with her arriving at work in the morning, and I'm going to read just a little bit of that, because the experience of coming to work every day at a clinic, of course, something Jamia knows very well, having been a clinic escort, it's a singular experience, and most people can't imagine what it is like to face this gauntlet of blowback every morning just showing up for work. So this first scene in the book, this is Claudia at work looking out the window at the protesters who've assembled on Ash Wednesday. The novel's set in Boston, very Catholic city. So Ash Wednesday is a really big protest day outside the clinic. So this is Claudia, my main character. On a frigid Wednesday morning in mid-February, a crowd gathered in front of the clinic, their backs to Mercy Street. Claudia stood at a second-floor window in the staff kitchen, counting heads. 36, she said. Seen from above, the group looked organized. They stood in concentric circles like the growth rings of a tree. In the center were the professionals, archdiocesan priests in slick nylon dress slacks, a few monks from the Franciscan monastery in New Bedford, the tails of their brown robes peeking out from beneath winter coats. In the outer rings were the regular people, holding rosary beads or carrying signs. "Did you count those guys in back?" asked Mary Fahey, the nurse practitioner. A few lurkers stood at the margins, staring at cell phones like bored strangers at a bus stop. Whether they were protesters or indifferent bystanders was impossible to say. "No," said Claudia, "I wasn't sure about them." 36, she felt, was a sizable number. In their bulky coats, they might have been carrying anything. There were 12 staff working at the clinic, except for Luis, the security guard, all female, all unarmed. So that's where the story begins. And that experience of encountering protesters every single day going to work is really, it has become normal for Claudia, it's become routine, but it has never become okay. And in order to understand, who this woman is, you have to understand that experience of working in this pressure cooker environment where you're constantly aware of the people around you who are opposed to what you're doing.
Thank you so much. It was so nice to be with the words also. So I really appreciate you reading. And I wanted to ask you, I was feeling really moved about you conveying with your reading the experiences of those on the very, very front lines of the reproductive justice movement. It's a contact sport is always the metaphor I've always tried to explain to people about what it was like to work at Planned Parenthood and, have people yell at me sometimes when I'm just trying to get to work or go to a meeting. And I was wondering, did you set out to unearth a story that had been underrepresented in fiction before as a result of your experiences? Was there something around that, or how did Claudia come to you to have that story told?
Well, abortion is one of those subjects where everybody has an opinion. You can't find someone who doesn't have a conviction about it. And yet a lot of those people know very little about the procedure, about the factors that go into making the decision and the consequences in women's lives. I mean, we know that about 1 in 4 American women will at some point have an abortion. I mean, it's so common that every single one of us knows somebody who's had one. And yet the climate is such that most women don't feel able to talk about it freely. So we might not even realize we know somebody who's had one. Is that common? So it just seemed to me that if people are going to have an ironclad opinion on this subject, they should know a little more what they're talking about. So for someone who does not have personal experience of abortion and has never worked in a clinic like this, there's a lot in this novel that might be surprising. And I think it's really important that people have some better information at hand and know a little bit more about the topic before digging their heels in and having an opinion.
Thank you so much. And I think, the misinformation is really powerful. And I was wondering, Shannon, if I can bring you in on that to say, in your work, what do you think is the thing that is widely misunderstood or the misinformation, and how can a book like this help people understand what's at stake?
I think, probably the most misunderstood and least talked about thing is the difficulties of pregnancy, right? And the extraordinarily high maternal mortality rates that we have in this country, where particularly in states where abortion is strictly regulated, and the just astoundingly high maternal mortality rates that we have, especially for Black women and poor women and women of color and women in immigrant communities. Pregnancy is exceptionally hard, and we provide very little support for women and girls and pregnant people who are going through that. And I think the most misunderstood thing is that abortion sits within the full spectrum of reproductive care. That this is not something that happens in isolation, that abortion is something sometimes elective and sometimes medically necessary, but from the perspective of the American Public Health Association, from the perspective of the American Medical Association or the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, all of whom we represent, abortion sits within the suite of reproductive care. And I think one thing that we have done in this country, because it has been so politicized, is to make kind of abortion an exception. And there's this abortion exceptionalism. We're talking about something extraordinary, something unusual, something about which we're polarized. And I think that's a fundamental misunderstanding. I think, as Jennifer said, 1 in 4 women will have an abortion. Many more people will experience miscarriage. Many people experience challenges in pregnancy, getting pregnant, staying pregnant, successfully delivering. Many people know people who have, had really life-threatening, deliveries. And so I think that is a fundamental misconception and failure on our part, which is to talk openly and with care about how we provide access to healthcare, how we provide just access to healthcare across the country. And I think abortion really sits within that discussion, but it has been used as a rallying cry for legislative purposes. And so I think, most people support abortion, right? Like you might support an anti-abortion agenda as a political means to an end, but when you look at the polling, for themselves, their families, people that they know, most people are generally supportive of abortion and keeping Roe. And so you have a major disconnect between the use of abortion as a rallying cry and political tool and where it sits from a health perspective. And I think that is, I think that's a travesty. I think that endangers the lives and health and well-being of women and girls throughout the country. And so, if there's one misunderstanding that you could try to correct, it is a macro level misunderstanding about pregnancy and the challenges of getting, staying, and being pregnant, childbirth, and kind of the full suite of medical care and reproductive care around that, of which abortion is a part, but far from the only part.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I've always been really passionate about this issue, but became extra emboldened when I learned more about Black maternal mortality rates and really thought about how, this is a fight for my life and across class that Black women in this country die from childbirth more than any other population. And so I'm just really glad that you connected those, because it's a passion that a lot of people don't know about. And that leads me to ask Jennifer about the role of race. And there is one in Mercy Street. And I was wondering if you could talk about what you were thinking about in terms of writing race, and also how it speaks to the larger issues at stake.
Yeah. I really love the jacket of this book, and I think this will help me answer that question. It's a great looking book, but what I love most about this jacket is that it really does convey an important fact about the clinic where I volunteered and about a lot of these clinics. The clinic where I was by far the most diverse, integrated, inclusive space I've ever encountered in the city. And although the women on the cover are, pink, blue, and purple, so as not to be too literal, it does convey that this is really an experience that women from all backgrounds have, women of different ages, different socioeconomic backgrounds, different racial backgrounds, cultural backgrounds. And that is certainly true of the clinic in the book, that you see the women that Claudia counsels, and they are really from every corner of the city, from all different circumstances. It's also significant in the story in that the antagonist to Claudia, a man named Victor Prime, who is I guess I would call him an anti-abortion activist. He's an abortion opponent anyway. A lot of what motivates him actually is racism. And he's an older guy. He's an old white guy. He's a Vietnam vet. He doesn't live in Boston, where most of the story takes place. He lives in Appalachia, similar to the place where I grew up in Western Pennsylvania. And he really is a guy who sees the world in racial terms, who feels that his race is being squeezed out, that that guys like him are in danger, that the demographics of the US are threatening the white majority in this country. And part of the reason abortion is so disturbing to him is the idea that white women would have one. He has no problem at all with women of color having abortions, but it's the problem for him is that white women do this, and this is worsening the problem, and he's really in this panic about white people losing control of things, and so he thinks of abortion as a big part of the problem, and something has to be done about this to keep white women from aborting fetuses. It's fine if other women do it. It's actually desirable, but not for white women. So, when you think about people who oppose abortions, people have all different sorts of reasons. Often they're religious reasons. But this character, Victor Prine, was interesting to me because his reasons are not religious. It's what motivates him is dark and twisted, and it has nothing at all to do with religion. He's in fact an atheist. So it's in some ways it subverts some of our ideas about people who are opposed to abortion. It's more complicated than it looks on its face.
Yeah, when you were talking about him, when I was reading the book, I was thinking about the tragedy in Charlottesville, and how I was very upset that the media wasn't talking enough about the fact that the mission statement that Richard Spencer and others had been putting forth actually called on white women to do their part and have white babies and perpetuate and bolster the patriarchy, keep white power. And so there was a moment of reading and thinking about how, this is very real for very extremist right-wing hardliners. And it led me to think about Shannon's work and how she's talked about the reckoning that's happening. And I was wondering if Shannon could speak a bit about how much of this is born from a broader extreme agenda, because we see this through characters like Victor, and we see this in legislation. So I was wondering if you could speak a bit about that as well.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that when you try to think about and understand the vast slate of anti-abortion laws, this has been a long practice with a long history that is deeply embedded in more than half the states in the country, right? This is not new. It is not primarily religiously motivated. And there are many states in the country that have laws that are what we call trigger laws, where abortion will become instantly criminalized if Roe is reversed. There are many states that have, over the past many years, passed laws that are specifically designed to restrict access to abortion, right? And they have been designed to do that in a number of ways. One is by just excessively burdening the right, making it extraordinarily difficult for women to access reproductive care because of the number of visits and the number of hoops, use not the technical legal term, but the practical term, hoops that you have to jump through, waiting periods, parental consent, requirements, hospital admitting privileges. There were a whole series of what we refer to as targeted restrictions of abortion providers, where instead of burdening the patient, you burden the doctor or the clinic and layer on to anybody who provides abortion, just excessive regulation that you would never see for a similarly safe procedure. And I guess that's another fundamental thing, right? Abortion is not only part of regular reproductive care, but it's a very safe procedure and safer than virtually any most other outpatient procedures, right? So you take
and safer than childbirth
essential.
also.
right? And you layer it with regulations. And so, what's going on there? I think Michelle Goodwin's work coming out of the University of California at Irvine is terrific on this, at the long history of misogyny and racism that feeds into these abortion laws, right? Because when you talk about abortion, you're talking about the ability to choose when, whether, and with whom to have children. And that control over reproductive life is essential to participation in political life and economic life in the broader public sphere. And so in restricting access to a basic decision about whether to continue a pregnancy, that is a deep restriction on the personal liberty of women who are pregnant or could become pregnant. And so I think, that's not new news. And to me, I keep coming back to, this is fundamentally both about restricting care for women, about undervaluing women's health, about keeping women from fully participating in public life, and mostly, and in many formerly slaveholding states, a deeply, not just misogynist but racist view of reproductive care. These are, this is not new that you would involve the legislature in restricting who can have children and whether they can have access to care. And the communities that are hardest hit by the current set of laws are the same communities that have always been hardest hit by those kinds of restrictions. And those are Black communities and poor communities, and really all women and girls and people who can be pregnant in all those states. And so I think, these laws are of a piece, right, with voting restrictions. And if you want to think about kind of what's going on here, I don't think about it and we'll see it playing out in religious terms so much as like, who is it that we invite to be part of our polity, right? Who is the public sphere for? And one way to restrict that is restricting access to the franchise, access to voting. And another way is just to make it extraordinarily difficult for women to be participants. And when you take away the ability to control reproduction, that is the effect of it, right? And you can see that coming, and that's a deliberate move.
The deliberateness, that is so chilling. Just, I know it, but then hearing you say it, we're seeing it play out every day. And so, you mentioned religion, and after we had a prep call for today, and after we had our call, I learned that Colombia became one of the new majority Catholic countries to decriminalize abortion. In the past 18 months, we've seen Argentina, Mexico, Ireland, and now Colombia decriminalize abortion. And I wanted to ask Jennifer about this because you really intricately draw the nuances of humans on all sides of this, and how religious fundamentalism and racism and misogyny connect. But hearing this news and seeing how countries where there are majority Catholic populations are moving, I was curious about your thoughts about what it meant to write the layers and the complexities.
Oh, well, this story is set in Boston, and that is not an accident. Boston is arguably the most Catholic city in America. And Boston is also the site of the huge explosion of scandal over clergy sex abuse of children. That happened in Boston too. And for the city of Boston, it was really a seismic event. In the early 2000s, the Boston Globe broke this story about how the Boston Archdiocese had, looked the other way when there were all these cases of child molestation by priests. So the Boston you see in Mercy Street is very much a post-Catholic city. The Catholic Church in Boston has never really recovered from those revelations. Church attendance is way down, and I don't know that it's going to go back up. This is really a city where the church has lost a lot of credibility with people, particularly on sexual matters. And yet the first thing you see in the novel is the Catholic clergy leading the protest outside this clinic. And it's, you know, it's that juxtaposition is very deliberate in the novel, that, you know, that the people who were holding the signs and chanting outside the clinics are representing the same institution that has really, you know, has not lived up to its own standards in terms of sexual morality. So that's part of the fabric of the book. You know, Boston is a post-Catholic city, and what opposition to abortion looks like there. So that's where it begins. And then later, of course, this antagonist to Claudia, this anti-abortion activist, Victor Prine, is coming from a very different place and is not religious at all. So it really speaks to the range of motivations people have for being extremely threatened by the idea of abortion. I personally believe that at the root of it is a desire to control women's sexuality and punish women's sexuality. And you know, that is very much the thinking of Victor Prine, is that you know, a woman who is pregnant and doesn't want to be has herself to blame, kind of. And so there's a real punitive aspect to his thinking about it that I think is not uncommon.
Yeah, I was thinking about how the retort I've often had with the Victor Primes that I've encountered is to say, because they're usually not fans of big government, in quotes, is to ask, what would you think if we started having Supreme Court mandates for you to have to get forced vasectomies? Would that be something you would be in support of? And it's interesting to flip it on its head, to look at what it means to for someone to kind of hear it and have the click moment of saying, oh, reproductive coercion isn't great, when I see my full humanity in it. So when you said that, it just made me think, because I've, without fail, never seen anyone who has received that to say, oh, there's a click moment that they have with it. So there's another question I wanted to ask, which is that you chose narrative storytelling to illustrate this discourse. And what do you think the role of narrative storytelling is for this conversation?
You know, it is such a powerful tool. I really believe this. Fiction is the best technology we have for getting inside another person's mind and heart. I mean, you can't do that in journalism. You can't even do that in poetry, but fiction can do that. It gives you access to people's consciousness. And in this story, you know, I'm very deliberately getting inside the heads of people who see this very differently. Some of them hold views that I find completely offensive, but it's part of the thing you do in fiction. It's the magic of point of view. So at different times in the story, I'm writing from Claudia's point of view. I'm writing from Victor Prine's point of view. There are a couple other characters whose heads I get inside as well. And it's one of the things fiction does best. You know, we're at a point in this culture where we have stopped talking to people who don't agree with us. And that's kind of true on all sides. It is significant that I wrote this entire novel in the Trump years. And it's on every page of the book. You know, I was swimming in the same water everybody else was politically in those years. And it's my sense of urgency at what we all lived through as a country is really the thing that motivated the writing of this book.
And you really feel the sense of urgency on the page. So I want to congratulate you on that as well. I really enjoyed reading Mercy Street. And Shannon, I have a question for you about the storytelling as well. How do you think storytelling can help us understand what's at stake constitutionally, also in our local laws, and how can it help us understand what we can do and how we can help others understand?
Like I'm with Jennifer. I think storytelling is incredibly powerful, and a means to bridge some differences and to have people think past the, red flag of the issue or the word and into what it actually means. And the kind of storytelling that you also might think about is just storytelling again about pregnancy, about miscarriage, about abortion. And about those choices, about the difficulties of, childcare, of contraception, of relationships. I think that there is a whole you know, the story, right? The story that you heard, Jennifer, from your caller, that if I'm, if I have this, if I my ex knew he would come shoot my kids, like that doesn't surprise me at all. But I spend a lot of time um, working on, domestic violence issues and issues that touch on reproductive justice. And when you work in that space, these are the stories that are people's lived lives all over the place and all the time. It is extraordinarily difficult to be poor, to live in states that do not provide, prenatal care, that do not provide postnatal care, that do not provide child care, where the maternal mortality rates are just extraordinarily high, right? So this is life for lots of people, and we don't talk about it that much. Like, where is women's health and the health of girls in the great, political dialogue? To me, that is one of the most urgent and the most important issues that we can be talking about, probably right up there with voting rights. And I think they go together, and I don't think it's a coincidence. But I think, we need to talk about these things more. And one thing that we can all do is, just talk about how hard it is, right? It's hard to say, like, look, it's hard to be pregnant. It is dangerous. There are all kinds of health complications that come with pregnancy. And it's okay to be honest about that and share those stories. And I think it's important to talk about how hard it is to get access to care and how hard it is to have babies and the whole slate of things. And some of these, countries, the Catholic countries, like Colombia, Mexico, Ireland, pivotal moments in those countries and many other countries that have been moving in a more liberal direction, right, have been stories about women who have been the victims of criminalization of abortion, right? So in Ireland, where abortion is criminal, there is, just a pivotal moment where a mother needs an abortion because she is in sepsis, right? And there were protesters and signs which are like, she has a heartbeat too, right? And telling the story of women like that, where the decision not to perform an abortion because it is criminal to do so endangers and kills the pregnant women, right? And that's a choice. And people being jailed, right, for miscarriages or stillbirths that are just one of the difficulties of childbirth, but you can't tell the difference between that and abortion, and people are thrown in jail for that. And those stories become rallying cries, and it is, hugely tragic, right? You have to reach that point to have the rallying cry, and you sure hope we don't have to have those stories be our rallying cries here. But that is, when you criminalize abortion across huge swaths of the country, that is where I fear we are headed. So, I'd like to start talking about those stories sooner rather than later, for people to speak about these difficult but very important issues in all the ways and all the contexts, so that they become part of the broader dialogue, right?
And I loved how you spoke about, we need to talk about it. When I heard you say we need to talk about it, leads me to my last question for Jennifer before we go to Q&A, where we want all of you to join our circle. And we're in a square, but I like to imagine we're in a circle right now, and ask your questions. And with the we need to talk about it, I was envisaging what it would be like for people to have a book club around Mercy Street in the spirit of the consciousness raising groups, in the second wave feminist consciousness raising. But now, as people are really yearning to be back together and to reconnect after so much time apart and social distancing, and thinking about, what it would mean to smash stigma together and build empathy through a story in the way that only fiction can do. And I was curious if you could speak a bit about if you've thought about this being read in community and a book club, what kinds of conversations you might hope for people to have as a result of meeting the characters in Mercy Street.
I think that I hope people will think about is the wide range of reasons why a person might come to this decision to end a pregnancy. I think people who are opposed to abortion have maybe a very narrow idea of who has abortions. And one thing I learned in my volunteer work was the vast range of people who need abortions. They're not all, teenage girls, unmarried, still in school, maybe. I think that's the idea most people have. And certainly that those are some of the people who have abortions. But there are women in their 40s who come to this conclusion, who have families already, who've had several children. There are people who do this for economic reasons. They do it because there are health concerns, because there are relationships that are unstable. There are lots and lots of women living in domestic violence situations who come to this conclusion. And I think to talk about these different reasons humanizes the whole question. It's very easy to reduce this if you don't think about actual people involved. And one of the things Mercy Street does is look at the context of this, in women's lives. And so I think there's a lot to talk about there for book clubs.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to recommend it to mine. So I'm excited to have that conversation too. So now I'm excited to bring you all into the chat and the Q&A. And thank you for all of the great questions. So Barbara has a question for you, Jennifer. How did you decide on the line in the first paragraph, "Our arrival is not a beginning, it is a consequence"? It is one of the most powerful lines I think I've ever read in a book.
Oh, well, that's it is that idea is so very central to this narrative, that all the life that exists before a child is born, culminates in the birth of that child. And it's people's life circumstances that are examined in this story, and so that first paragraph, I had to write the whole book before I could write that paragraph. This happens a lot to me when I'm writing. I don't know what I've written until I have a draft and I step back and look at it and I think, and that paragraph came after spending the 4.5 years writing the book. Then I finally understood how central that was, but I couldn't have written that paragraph first.
I love it. We had a question from Wendy about how long it took to write the book. So 4.5 years. And it's interesting. You said the cycle, right? The cycle of an election cycle, of a sea change. But Wendy has another question, which is interesting to me as someone who works in publishing. Were there any people along the way in publishing who were uncomfortable with this book because of the abortion conversation?
I'm happy to say there were not. I'm a very secretive writer. So in the first few years I worked on this book, nobody knew what I was writing about. Nobody, not my agent, not my editor, not the closest people in my life, my boyfriend, nobody knew. So by the time anybody got to see it, it was sort of a done deal. It was fully cooked by the time anybody knew what I was writing about. And I've gotten nothing but support from my editor, from my publisher, from everybody at Echo. Everybody has really been behind this book. I'm really grateful for that.
Thank you. And that's really great to hear. That makes me really happy as an editor too.
I had to phone a friend for the Q&A session. I can't help.
Oh, hi. Hi. So I have some other great questions too. So Antasia, or is it Antasia? I hope I pronounced it correctly, is saying, hello, I'm not sure about the minds of those in protesting positions, but can you touch on an example of what they would say when they're yelling?
It's a lot of it is religious. A lot of it is sloganeering. You hear things like, it's a child, not a choice. That abortion stops a beating heart. So there's a lot of sloganeering that goes on. What is very striking to me about all the slogans is that they have everything to do with this idea of the fetus and nothing at all to do with the woman who is carrying the fetus. And it really makes you wonder if the woman in question enters into their thinking at all.
Well, that leads me to a question that I found interesting about, whether the woman in question is thought about. And this question is from Leslie. What differences do you see between men who oppose abortion and women who oppose it?
Oh, I love this question. This is very central to Mercy Street. The women I know who oppose abortion, which I will be honest is an awful lot of women, because as I said, I grew up in a small town, socially conservative, overwhelmingly Catholic. I never met anybody who was pro-choice until I went to college. True story. So I've known lots and lots of both men and women who are anti-abortion. The women I know who feel that way, it is, I think, in every case religious. The men who feel that way, I think there's more going on there in many cases. Sometimes the religious reasons are the ones they cite, but I think there's something deeper. I think it's really this feeling of losing control, this sense that that women are, steering the ship here when it comes to, childbearing, and that men are not, that men can be overruled, that they can be vetoed, that a woman gets to make this decision by herself and they don't get a say in it. And I think in many, many cases, it's this feeling of a loss of control.
Mm. Shannon, do you feel like you've seen a difference in terms of the gender of the opponents?
I'm hesitating on that question, to me, because when we're litigating these cases and we're dealing with states adopting legislation, what we're dealing with is legislative action, right? And governors. And you look at the governors of Mississippi, of Texas, of Louisiana, you look at those state legislatures, you look at the like macro level organized opponents of access to care, and those are institutionalized. They are part of a movement, right? That there has been a transformative turn in the federal courts through Trump appointees who are very hostile to access to care. And so when I see it at a macro level, we're talking about political forces and not about individual preferences. And so I think, again, I go back to the surveys, right? Like whatever people say out loud, most of the surveys tend to show that, like, nationally, you would have popular support for Roe remaining the law of the land, right? People tend to like the fact that abortion is constitutionally protected and they don't want to see that changed. And the fact that it is constitutionally protected allows some freedom to express opposition for it in a way that will not materially affect your life or the lives of those you care about. So I think there's a way in which that people are free to have views without having the consequence of those views, as long as the right is protected. But there is a massive movement to reverse Roe, right? And that movement is reaching, I don't know if I would call it its apex, but it is like, this is a transformative moment, right? The courts look different, and there is a direct challenge now pending before the US Supreme Court asking it to reverse Roe. And in all likelihood, it will, in name or in fact, by June. And I don't think that comes down at all to individual preferences or gender differences in how people oppose abortion. I don't really think it has much to do with abortion as itself. Like, I think there's a lot more going on, and that it is a much broader political issue and less one of personal preference when you get to the level of legislative action and judicial action.
So also just hearing you talk about Roe being in peril, and what those of us who've been close to this issue have known, that this is happening. It is happening now. It is happening. Linda's question is really interesting to me, and I think something I've thought a lot about, which is, given the current environment, do you think that there will ever be any sense of understanding between pro-choice and pro-life believers?
It's not looking good. I hate to say it, but I don't see signs of of mutual understanding right now. I think if anything, we are moving further and further apart. So yeah, I'm afraid I don't have an optimistic answer there.
That's funny. I would go the other way, actually.
Oh, good.
You know,
Good.
I think
like your answer better already.
I mean, look, I think I think abortion, there's abortion, the political issue, and then there's like what it means to terminate a pregnancy, right? And I think there are lots of people who feel strongly about abortion as a political issue, as a rallying cry, as a reason to vote, as a reason to vote for certain people and certain things, and to feel good about certain judges. But many people get pregnant, and many people have miscarriages, and many people have challenges in pregnancy and need access to reproductive care. And everybody, whether you are pro or anti-abortion as a political issue, many people need or have someone that they know or love who needs access to medical care around a pregnancy that may or may not succeed. And so in some ways, when you take away the political valence of the issue and you say, look, it's unfortunate that your anti-abortion, person that cannot terminate their pregnancy, cannot safely miscarry, cannot have a medical miscarriage when their pregnancy is not viable. Like, that's an issue, I think, that actually brings people back together. If you say, look, you're anti-abortion, you want to be pregnant, you are in fact pregnant, but your pregnancy is not viable, and your wife, your spouse, whomever, can't have medically necessary and prescribed care because of the laws that you pass. Like, that is a moment where it comes back around. I think it's a very long and very painful and very dangerous path. But I do think that people drastically misunderestimate what it means to criminalize abortion. And so in states where abortion becomes criminal, abortion is like medically prescribed. It is a means to deal with things that happen during pregnancy. And if you take it away completely, that affects people who did not expect it was going to affect them in ways that are dangerous and perilous. And that's what you see in many countries where they're moving from, very restrictive laws to a more liberal approach to access to abortion, because you start to understand the consequences of having such draconian rules. But that is a long, treacherous, and dangerous path, and its burdens are borne most heavily by communities for whom access is hardest, right? And those are the communities that we've been talking about all along. So you hope, how can you speed that up, right? The goal, I think, is if Roe is reversed and access is limited, you want people to take that journey quicker and with less, death and injury along the way. And so I think that's why I keep saying you have to talk about that and talk about it more broadly with all kinds of audiences, and talk about it not as an issue of abortion, but as an issue of pregnancy and reproductive care and healthcare for women and children.
It's super interesting because it's one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot, as a lot of people who our opponents might have nuanced issues about, for example, or nuanced ideas about contraception, and they don't realize, legislatively, the same opponents, that's what they're coming for next. And so I think it is interesting to talk about healthcare specifically, and how why it's a political issue here and not in other countries who see it broadly as a form of care, like contraception and other forms of care on that spectrum. And so, speaking of other countries, and you gave a great segue for Rosemary's question to carry us home, which is, have you received international feedback for your book? Have members of nations that have liberal or conservative abortion laws reached out to you?
No, the book is brand new. It's been out exactly 3 weeks. So it is still just beginning to make its way in the world. And I'm afraid it has not made it that far yet. Maybe it will, but stay tuned.
Well, I'm excited because I have time for one more question. I was thinking I might not, but this is a question from Anne Marie Cunningham, and she is asking Jennifer, Is your antagonist a white supremacist? In Mississippi, there are white supremacists who are pro-choice.
My antagonist is a white supremacist, but that is news to me. That's interesting about Mississippi. I didn't know that.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting too. And I think it speaks to kind of what you said about Victor, being very focused on a specific white supremacist agenda, but being pro-choice for some and anti for others in terms of who he felt he needed to not have access and who he thought should. So we, I believe, have gotten through all of our questions. I want to make sure that if anyone has any more burning questions, we have a few more minutes before the wonderful team at Theater for Fiction.
You check the questions to me. I'm going to give a shout out to, I saw one person sign in from Harbor Springs, Michigan, which is a tiny town of 1,100 people right where I grew up. So
Oh, wow.
I was excited about that. I grew up in Petoskey, which is slightly larger, like 6,000 people instead of 1,000 people. But glad we had time to get that in.
Yes, no, I love it. I was just seeing that. I think all the three of us have people from our home states, our hometown.
I know, like say hi to my mom.
And I think it's amazing. But it also has a feeling of, we were talking about community in this book and community. Connie, thank you for your post. Connie is talking about the urgency and wants us to look at the Rise Up for Abortion Rights protests that are happening on March 8th. And so I want to say, Connie, we see you and thank you so much for using this as an organizing moment. And Connie is saying, Jennifer, you said a sense of urgency compelled you to write this book. And we now face the obliteration of abortion rights by SCOTUS by late spring. Isn't this the moral equivalent of reversing Brown versus Board? And don't people have to get in the streets? But mainstream organizations are not calling for this, and the new group is. So I'm just letting everybody know, if you feel moved and once you read the pages of Mercy Street and you become even more moved, there are ways that you can take action. And so I was wondering with Jennifer and Shannon, before we say goodbye, if there's one action you would like everyone who joined us today to take, please share. My action will be, I hope everybody will sign up to learn more about the ERA Coalition, because if we have constitutional equality as women, then I think that will help us advance, but also to support the Center for Reproductive Rights.
Jennifer, you want to go ahead? You want me to go next?
Well, I think this question about choices, in my mind, it is directly tied to what we're facing now with voting rights. And I can't think of these two things as separate. So, if you care about one, I think you have to care about the other.
Yeah, that's honestly what I've been saying to people also. If you care about women's access to healthcare, as you should, access for women and girls across the country, that starts with voting rights. And when you take away voting rights, you're taking away everything else. So I think voting rights are essential. And I think, abortion is healthcare, and you don't need to wait for a judge. You don't need to wait for a constitutional right to protect that. You can think about how can we make more just access to healthcare for women and girls than anybody who can be pregnant. We can and should do a better job of taking care of anybody who wants to, is trying to, doesn't want to, could be, might not be pregnant. It is very hard. It is very dangerous. There are all kinds of health complications. We need to recognize and talk about that and provide people with care. And there are lots of ways to do that. And I think the most important thing is to do something, right? Do something, even if it's talking to your friends about it, do your book club, think about how you can, if it's something that you care about, that's important to you, that you're outraged about, translate that outrage into some kind of action that makes it easier for somebody else in their life.
That's so powerful. And it just made me think with what you both said as your really powerful points about voting rights. NARAL is doing really great work about voting rights work and tying it to reproductive rights. So getting involved with your local NARAL is also an option. And Norma, who is in the circle with us, made a really important point that I would just like to read. there's a difference between abortion and safe abortion, and abortion won't go away, but safe abortion might. And I think, it's an interesting point to talk about what happens when we don't give people access to safe, comprehensive care. So thank you so much for mentioning that, and really moved by the conversation we've had. Thank you so much, Shannon and Jennifer, for the amazing work you do. And thank you to the Center for Fiction.
Thanks so much, Jamia. Thanks, Jennifer.
Thank you to all three of you for this really wonderful and really important conversation. If you haven't gotten Mercy Street yet, go buy it from the Center for Fiction, and have a good night, everyone.